We see it, we feel it, it's around us. The impact of climate change is everywhere, and it's taking a toll on the most vulnerable communities in Asia. But how did we get here? What can we do about it? Hello, everyone. I'm Christine Sabilio, a journalist and advocate, and this is Saving Asia. Climate change is here, and millions are already experiencing its effects, making it one of the defining challenges of today's generation. But not all climate impacts are created equal, leading to injustice across nations around the world. And developing countries, particularly in Asia, are now in the front lines. But we are also home to young minds, a new generation energized over the need to solve the climate challenge. Some of them are here today. From the Philippines, we have Patricia Alburo, an architecture student and an active member of Mission Isla, a youth-led environmental organization in the Philippines. Joining us from Malaysia is Jesselyn Ted Jingying, an engineering student actively participating in numerous groups advocating climate awareness in Malaysia. We also have from Malaysia, Ang Ting Yong, an environmental science student and a member of student-led orgs focusing on climate awareness. From Indonesia, we have Jilan Anisak, a finance student and an active member of Jerakan Pramuka, the largest national youth organization in Indonesia. And we also have from Indonesia, Tristan Adinadir, a senior high school science student and a nature lover. Thank you all for being here with us. Can you tell us more about what you're hoping to learn today, and perhaps what you've experienced in your home country about climate change? We can start with you, Patricia.
Personally, I would like to learn more about the different countries, how climate change is affecting them, especially people from all around Asia here, like the different students you have mentioned. So I'm very excited to learn more about them. It's really bad right now, like especially with everything that's been happening with the pandemic and all. But to be genuinely honest, as a privileged human being, it doesn't affect me as much as it affects others. Whenever I would feel hot or cold, or if there are like natural disasters, there are resources available in my home to provide me with comfort. And I think the worst that I have experienced is the massive flooding of Ondoy. We were all in the second floor already that time because the flood was filling up our ground floor. Back then, it was so bad and traumatizing, and I was just in elementary school then. That's the worst that I have experienced. But what more to those people who even had to evacuate, those who had to witness their loved ones' deaths right before their eyes.
Thank you, Patricia, for sharing with us your experience of one of the worst floods in the Philippines, at least in Metro Manila. How about Jesselyn? Perhaps you can share with us your experience as well.
Hi, okay. So actually, I have seen a lot of individual efforts from activists and students or NGOs, but I want to learn about what can we do in terms of systemic change, maybe on a policy level, driving like the whole country or holding government or more like larger companies more accountable for the actions so that we can drive a bigger change faster because this is like getting very prominent and we cannot just rely on personal interest or some political will for us to push forward and like drive climate action. That's the main point I want to learn. Other than that, from my personal experience with climate change, I would like to say that I'm just like Patricia. I think where I live is quite unaffected compared to a lot of different countries. But what I can observe personally is the little subtle changes that occur over the year. Maybe I heard more news about landslide, more flooding, and I can feel the heat just sweltering up every single year, just getting hotter and hotter. And now, like these few years, I've seen the rising water level. It's just all this subtle change and a lot more drastic news all over the world as well. So it's getting very concerning, despite me not being like one of those who experienced the first-hand effect of climate change and how scary and dangerous it could be. But I could see that it's really affecting a lot of vulnerable communities all around the world. So yeah, I just wish that we can all do a little bit more to help each other out.
Definitely. Thanks so much, Jesselyn. How about Yong? Yong, you're an environmental science student.
So basically, what I would like to learn is that first of all, I would like to experience like what it's like to be a climate change activist or advocate because being an advocate is kind of new to me. So it's like I want to learn more about it. And also I want to learn like what is climate justice and also how experts view climate justice. And about me, whether I have experienced climate change, just like Jesseline and Patricia, I'm also come from a quite a privileged family. So it's like, it's not really affecting me much, but like based on the news and the newspaper article, seeing like people get affected by natural disaster or floods or something like that, it's kind of saddens me because like climate change is actually happening, but some people they still don't believe it. So it's like quite saddened, you know. Hope that people make the change to prevent it getting worse until the point that it can't be stopped.
Climate justice definitely is something that we'll be talking about in this episode. Now, Jilan or Nana from Indonesia.
From here, I want to learn about the climate issue in other countries, climate justice, and all about climate change issues. I'm very concerned about how the climate change issue in Indonesia is very severe. I'm one of the affected people in my country, and I'm very concerned about the many disasters in Indonesia caused by climate change in the world. I hope I can take something from this event to apply here. Indonesia needs a change, but there's not much I can do yet. So I think I can do something after this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Jilan. And now we have Tristan. Tristan, you're the youngest, I think, in the panel. What would you like to learn? And have you experienced anything related to climate change?
First, my personal experience of climate change in my area, since I live in Bogor, also known as the rain city of Indonesia. I think the climate change that occurs in my area is the high rainfall that continues to happen every evening and night. And maybe it's the start of the season, but I think it's happening more often than it's ever been. The intense rainfall, there are so many climate change that affect many countries, but in Indonesia, there are extreme events, sea level rise and temperature rise. And I want to know how to prevent the climate change before it affect more to our world and our earth, since there are so many news talking about how climate change affect people and the world. Indonesia produce a lot of pollution that cause the greenhouse effect and make the ozone layer thinner. So I would like to know more how to prevent that. I think that's all.
Thank you, Tristan. Those are quite interesting insights, sharing, and the questions as well. I am much older than you guys, but I have my fair share of experiences. And you're right, we have our anecdotal stories about how we feel like the climate is changing, right? It's getting hotter. And now we're joined by climate scientist Lourdes Tibig from the Philippines. She's one of the authors of the latest report issued by the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, or IPCC. Thank you so much, Lourdes, for joining us today. Can you tell us more about the science behind climate change? I know you've been studying this with the IPCC and you've been going over a lot of reports and studies, but how would you explain it to the youth? Why are we experiencing global warming and these changes in our climate?
We have global warming, meaning temperature increases all over the globe. Hardly any part of the globe that has not experienced temperature increases. And how did we get here? We got here because of human-induced or human activities coming from our use of fossil fuels, so that when you use fossil fuels, you are emitting carbon dioxide. Also, other greenhouse gas emissions does not just include carbon dioxide from fossil fuels, it also includes methane from rice cultivation, unfortunately. Also from the way we use our waste, like if you put them in landfills, anything that decays will be emitting methane, and the way we deal with our waste will define the amount of methane emissions that goes into the atmosphere. Another greenhouse gas that we can talk about is nitrous oxide, which is mostly an emission that comes from, unfortunately, developing countries' farm agriculture. That is, when we use chemical-based fertilizers and pesticides, the moment we use them in the fields, we will be emitting nitrous oxides. And last but not least is the hydrofluorocarbons that come from sealants and collants, for example, what we use in our refrigerators, what we use in our air conditioning units. And these are contributing to this problem in the sense that most of these greenhouse gases have very long lifetimes. For example, carbon dioxide. You use your car. The moment you turn on your car, you're going to emit carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide's lifetime is 100 years. And it decays only half of that lifetime. So meaning, the moment you use gasoline in your car, the moment you run your car, you're a greenhouse gas that would stay in the atmosphere for more than 50 years. In the same manner, methane emissions will be staying in the atmosphere only for 13 years. I mean, that's the lifetime. But the capacity of methane to increase the temperature is almost 30 times the capacity of carbon dioxide. Methane emissions are short-lived in the sense that they are not as long as 100 years, but the capacity to hit the atmosphere or to hit the globe or to increase temperature is almost 30 times that of the capacity of carbon dioxide. It is much worse with nitrous oxides. Lifetime of nitrous oxide emissions is more than 130 years. Can you imagine how much longer it stays in the atmosphere? Now, all these emissions have been accumulating in the atmosphere, and this are what caused the very fast temperature increases. Now, what happens when we have temperature increases? We'll be seeing changes in the water cycle. We'll be seeing changes in the rainfall amounts. The problem with rainfall is not just the amount, it's not just the intensity, it is the erratic patterns of the rainfall that we receive. In some parts of the region, we get very, very extreme rainfall. In other parts, we get rainfall that are very little. It is not the same in the patterns of the erratic, the way rainfall arrives or the way rainfall is received in most places are already changing. One other thing that would really be of concern, especially to the Philippines, is the fact that with climate change, we are seeing more and more a signature, a fingerprint of the human-induced climate change in the increase in the intensity of our tropical cyclones. The Philippines is highly vulnerable to tropical cyclone occurrences.
Lourdes, you mentioned that the impact of climate change is different for different countries and communities, but why is there an urgent need to address climate change?
The projections for extreme events is that in the coming years, if there is no drastic global action, the intensity of tropical cyclones will be much higher, and it's not going to be, we are not going to wait long for that. We are seeing it little by little in terms of the number of super typhoons that have been occurring in our part of the globe, which is in the Philippines, and fortunately is situated in the very near the part of the Pacific Ocean, where sea surface temperatures are increasing. That could add to the intensity of the tropical cyclone that could form in the Philippine area of responsibility that affects the Philippines. Well, Vietnam, parts of Vietnam and parts of Thailand are sometimes affected by tropical cyclones, but they are not as much affected as the Philippines is.
We've heard from the news perhaps that there are different impacts of climate change for different countries. Why is that so? What's the science behind that?
When the temperature increases, it's not the temperature increase in the different parts of the globe are not equal. They're not the same. There are communities that will be feeling them more, and there are communities that will be seeing much more share of disasters from extreme events because there are very low access to resources, and that's where climate injustice begins. Anything that happens, because climate does not have any boundaries, anything that happens all over the globe will be affecting all parts of the globe, but our vulnerability depends primarily to resources in order to be able for us to cope with these adverse impacts. So usually it's the developing countries, the poor countries who have very poor access to resources. Unfortunately, very few of our countries all over the globe have done sufficiently enough in order to address the climate change issue.
How exactly can we assess the impact of climate change? We know that you've been doing work with the IPCC. How does that work exactly, and what can you see from the studies?
It is so complex. The issue of climate change and impacts is so complex. If we want to really assess how much impacts we are suffering from, we need to take a look at the chain impact analysis. And that's quite, there are direct impacts, there are indirect impacts. For example, temperature increases, the direct impact is a change in the water cycle, goes down into agricultural production, into water security, into human health, into human settlements. So it's so complex. The issue is so complex. This is the international agreement, limit the temperature increase within this century to only 1.5 degrees centigrade. We are seeing that most of the country signatories are not doing what they are supposed to do.
Lourdes, can you talk more about the climate action of different nations in the world, those who are most responsible for what we're experiencing now? Do you think they are taking enough action to address this?
If I may, I'd like to take a look at the list. Critically insufficient includes Iran, Russia, South Korea, Thailand. Highly insufficient includes Argentina, Australia, China, Indonesia, Canada, and Vietnam. Insufficient, you have the European Union, you have Germany, and you have South Africa and the United States and Switzerland. For almost sufficient, you have countries in Africa like Ethiopia and Kenya, and then countries in the Middle East like Morocco, and then countries in China, rather next to China, Nepal. And United Kingdom is listed as almost sufficient in terms of the emissions reduction targets that it has submitted to the UNFCCC. And there is only one country that is compatible with the target goal of the Paris Agreement, and this the Gambia. It's a very small country in Africa. I didn't see the Philippines, so I can't tell you how much is the effort that is being volunteered by the Philippines. Now, please remember, these are what you call assessment of the nationally determined contributions of the country signatories to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The contributions, the submissions are assessed, and in accordance with, are we going to achieve the goal of the Paris Agreement, which is limiting the temperature increase in this century to only 1.5 degrees centigrade. But what we are targeting is actually net zero by 2050. And for us to do that, we have got to have a peak emission before 2030. And most of the countries are doing that. In relation to the Paris Agreement, we have reached, according to the assessment, we have already reached a point of 1.1 degrees centigrade increase. So that means if we limit it to 1.5, so we only have 0.4 allowance. This is now 2021. So between 2021 and 2100, we have how many years more? 79 years. So how do we try to limit the increase to only 1.5?
Thank you, Lourdes. Perhaps as a wrap up, we've learned a lot about the science of climate change, about the different effects, how complex it is for different countries as well. Maybe your final message to the youth: how can we explain climate justice to them on an individual level, or still as collective action? There are a lot of student groups involved in the climate movement. How can they fight for climate justice? How can they contribute to all of this?
Okay, before I go to that, I want to highlight four things. One, that climate change is real and unequivocal. There is no room for climate skeptics. It's happening. It is beyond debate. Two, climate change is human induced. It's caused by human activities. So solutions, actions in terms of human activities. And lastly, climate change is largely by accumulating greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere and in the oceans. So that means simply there are two things that we can do: limit or reduce the emissions. And the other action is advocacy. I think the young people should have a very active voice in advocating for countries to abide by the reduction targets. They need to abide by the condition from the science that in order to reach the temperature goal, there should be a net zero emission by 2050. You don't just wait for the countries, for the national leaders to do something.
Thank you so much, Lourdes, for that very insightful discussion about the science of climate change and the importance of climate action and climate justice. We're going back to our student panel now. Guys, I just wanted to check with you. How did you take the discussion? What did you learn about the science of climate change? And I think more importantly, about the need for the youth and the rest of the world to act.
I think it's a lot of pressure for us, for our generation, because the future is dependent on us. We are so limited to doing just we think we can contribute greatly, but in reality, it's really not enough. Like, we need more people to come together and solve this problem. I think I am in the middle of seeing the future as something hopeful.
You're right. It seems like such a big task, but as she mentioned, the role of advocacy is very large, and the youth plays a large part in that. I think just having your voice here, like what we're doing here today, really helps. So thank you for sharing that, Patricia. How about you, Jesselyn? Are there any takeaways from what Lourdes has said, and did that make you think about your own role in climate action?
I can see that she shared a lot of facts and figures. It really provides a more holistic view of like a larger scale, like a global view as well. It's not just because my knowledge is limited to my community most of the time, but she touched on so many that are like outside of my continent or like other countries. Yeah, so that was very, very insightful. I think implementation is another issue, which I like we should really push harder. And as like despite us not being in government position or anything, people do have the power, do have the voice to push for change, try to engage climate deniers if they still think that it's a hoax, and then just get them to join us in this really big movement to push for climate action, to protect our environment, which is the right thing to do. I think that's all from me.
It's great that you and Patricia, raised more questions after this, because indeed, now that we know the foundations, it really opens up the discussion. Now we move on to Yong. Yong, you're an environmental science student. I'm curious about what your insights were.
Some of the things you mentioned, we actually do learn it in our course. At the same time, also, it kind of sparks my interest and also makes me want to learn more about climate justice. So basically, I hope that you can apply digital escape room or some online related games to climate change so that to gain awareness for people. Our government don't really care much about the environment, so it's a very sad also. So I hope that like with what I learned today, I can make a change and probably influence more people.
Definitely, it's not enough to know the science, right? And we're thankful for having scientists like Lourdes who are not only involved in, giving good foundation on the studies on climate change, but also discussing what can be done now that we know that the impact of it all. Tristan, as the youngest member of this panel, what is your takeaway when it comes to the need for the youth to act now?
I agree to Miss Lourdes that we can just wait here and witness the climate change and the disasters to destroy our world. I think it's kind of hard for us if there are a few people who wants to change and act now. So we need to voice this out to the world to change things for the better. I think that's all.
It's hard to tackle such a big global crisis, but there are portions of hope. There are opportunities for us to tackle climate action and climate justice. So now we move on to Nana. Nana, you're involved in youth organizations. Do you share the sentiments of our other panelists here? And is there something else that you want to talk about for this discussion?
I'm confused about how to unite our minds, how to build the power to unify them, and I hope we can work together. I hope we can do something together because I know I can do something big alone.
I think it's important to remember the impact of climate change on people, on humans, and it's not just about temperature rise, about typhoons, but there are lives at stake, and it has different effects on our communities. And your questions about action, hopefully, we'll be able to answer that in the next episodes. Thank you so much again for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again for our next episodes. So for everyone who's listening, that's it for this episode. But here's what we have for you next.
The fossil fuel companies are trying to hold on to their industries and governments are supporting them.
They have the ability, with the stroke of a pen, to make decisions which can save tons of carbon emissions.
We can only get there if very strong political pressure is put on governments. Individual actions and community actions are good, but they do not add up to the systematic change that we need.
I'm Christine Sabino, and thank you for listening. We hope this episode inspires you to take action to save not just Asia, but our planet. Join our community of climate advocates through Climate Tracker Asia's WhatsApp group or by following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Join us for another insightful discussion next time on Saving Asia.